It was a bright, brisk morning in early spring when Miss Jane Marple arrived in the picturesque village of Alderscombe, tucked neatly among the rolling green hills of Devon. The air smelled faintly of hyacinths, the sky was an unbroken blue, and the narrow lanes were still damp from the dawn dew. To the casual visitor, Alderscombe seemed the very picture of tranquility, an English postcard of serenity. But to those with keener eyes, the village had lately been humming with something else. Whisper. The gossip had begun, as gossip so often does at the vicarage tea. A rumour that someone rather important, indeed, someone of royal connection, was staying at Alderscombe Manor, the grand house at the edge of the village. It was said that Lady Evelyn Bainbridge, widowed these 10 years and known for her immaculate garden parties and firm opinions, had invited a guest of distinguished background. Some said a princess, others whispered a scandal. Miss Marple, having received a letter from her old friend Colonel Geoffrey Melrose, was visiting for a week's rest. Or so she told everyone. In truth, she found that villages, even those not her own beloved St. Mary Mead, were rarely dull. And Alderscombe promised to be anything but dull this spring. "Aye, Miss Marple," exclaimed Colonel Melrose as she stepped down from the motor coach at the village square. "Still punctual as a railway clock. Allow me to take your bag." "How kind, Geoffrey." Miss Marple smiled, handing him her modest valise. "I do hope your housekeeper will forgive me for troubling her. I'm told I'm quite fussy about tea." "My dear lady, Mrs. Pem will be delighted. She prides herself on her teapot. You'll find the village much as you left it, save for a few new faces. And of course," he added with a twinkle, "this latest royal excitement." "Royal excitement?" Miss Marple's blue eyes brightened with polite curiosity. "Oh yes. Lady Evelyn has taken in a guest. Some connection to the crown, so I hear." Naturally, tongues have wagged. "The postmistress insists it's the Duchess of Wexham incognito. Mrs. Pem swears it's the King's cousin. Between the two of them, we've practically got Buckingham Palace on the doorstep." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "And what does Lady Evelyn say?" "Not a word. Which, as you know, only makes the talk more feverish." 2. The Manor's shadow. That very evening, Miss Marple joined the Colonel and several others for dinner at Alderscombe Manor. Lady Evelyn Bainbridge was a handsome woman in her early 60s, with a regal bearing that suggested she'd once moved in grander circles. Her late husband, Sir Rowland Bainbridge, had served in the diplomatic corps. The manor, though a little faded, still possessed the quiet dignity of a house that had seen history. "Miss Marple of St. Mary Mead," Lady Evelyn greeted, extending a hand adorned with an heirloom sapphire. "I've heard of you, of course. Geoffrey tells me you have a rather remarkable head for observation." "I only notice small things, Lady Evelyn," Miss Marple replied modestly, "but small things are often the hinges upon which large doors turn." The hostess smiled faintly. "Indeed, I find that people who claim to notice only small things usually see more than anyone else." The other guests were introduced. Major Leonard Fitzroy, a retired officer with a booming laugh and a fondness for port. Miss Clara Denning, Lady Evelyn's young and nervous companion, pale as porcelain and forever glancing at her employer as though for permission to breathe. Mr. Harold Rivington, a London solicitor, sharp, featured and smooth, who claimed to be handling Lady Evelyn's late husband's affairs. And finally, the mysterious guest, a woman of striking poise who was introduced as Mrs. Lysandra Vale. She was in her late 30s, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, with the air of someone used to attention. Her accent was faintly foreign, continental, though hard to place. She smiled graciously at Miss Marple, yet there was something about her eyes, deep brown and guarded, that betrayed unease. Dinner was elegant but strained. Lady Evelyn's conversation was polished, but her companion Clara seemed perpetually on edge. Mr. Rivington was overly charming, his laughter a touch too loud. Major Fitzroy, after his third glass of claret, began reminiscing about the old days in India, until Lady Evelyn redirected him gently. Mrs. Vale spoke little. When she did, it was with an undertone of melancholy. "I find English villages so peaceful," she said softly, her gaze lingering on the darkened garden beyond the window. "Almost too peaceful. One forgets the world beyond the hedgerows." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but peace can be deceptive, like the surface of a pond, calm until one stirs the water." For the briefest moment, Mrs. Vale's expression tightened, as though Miss Marple's words had touched some hidden nerve. Then she smiled faintly and changed the subject. 3. A secret in the garden. The next morning, Miss Marple took her customary stroll through the village. She noted the small things others missed: the curtained window of the post office, when Mrs. Hatherley was gossiping inside, the vicar's bicycle leaning against the churchyard wall, the gardener from the manor, Tom Larkin, looking flustered as he carried a basket of wilted roses to the compost heap. Later that afternoon, she visited Lady Evelyn for tea in the rose garden. It was a fine day, the kind that made everything seem harmless. Bees hummed lazily, the manor's stone walls glowed honey gold, and the distant hills shimmered under a soft haze. Lady Evelyn, resplendent in lavender silk, poured tea with her usual composure. "I trust you slept well, Miss Marple." "Perfectly, thank you. I find country air most restorative." Clara Denning was arranging flowers nearby, her hands trembling slightly as she trimmed the stems. Mrs. Vale was nowhere to be seen. Lady Evelyn sighed. "Our guest prefers to take her tea privately in her room. I fear she is unaccustomed to society." Miss Marple stirred her cup. "Oh, I thought she seemed most charming." "She is," Lady Evelyn agreed coolly, "but fragile. Poor thing, a widow, lost her husband in tragic circumstances abroad. Some scandal, I believe, though I do not pry. She has sought peace here." Miss Marple said nothing, merely nodded. The faintest flicker of something, unease, guilt, had crossed Lady Evelyn's face at the word scandal. Clara suddenly dropped a vase. It shattered across the flagstones. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. How clumsy." "Clara," Lady Evelyn snapped, "do pay attention." "Yes, milady," Clara murmured, flushing crimson. As Miss Marple bent to help, she noticed a curious thing, a small photograph that had slipped from Clara's apron pocket. It showed Mrs. Vale standing beside a man in military dress. A man whose face was blurred, perhaps deliberately smudged. Before Miss Marple could comment, Clara hastily retrieved it and tucked it away. Miss Marple pretended not to notice, though her mind began, as always, to quietly assemble patterns. 4. The night of the storm that evening, a storm swept across Alderscombe. The wind howled through the hedgerows and rain lashed against the manor's windows. Inside, a fire crackled in the drawing room, where the guests had gathered after dinner. Major Fitzroy snored gently by the hearth. Lady Evelyn and Mr. Rivington played bridge. Clara read a novel in a corner, her eyes barely moving over the page. Miss Marple was knitting, her needles clicking softly. She watched with quiet amusement as Mrs. Vale stood by the window, gazing into the storm. "Most unpleasant weather," Miss Marple remarked. "It seems the sort of night when mischief might find an opportunity." Mrs. Vale gave a short, humorless laugh. "Mischief? In this house, Miss Marple, there is little else." Miss Marple looked up sharply, but before she could respond, Lady Evelyn called out from the card table, "My dear Lysandra, do stop brooding. Come and cut the cards." Mrs. Vale hesitated, then obeyed. Yet there was tension in her movements, the stiffness of a woman forced to play a role she no longer enjoyed. The clock struck 10. Thunder rolled like a cannon. Miss Marple excused herself early, claiming an old lady's need for rest, and retired to her guest room. But as she prepared for bed, she heard raised voices somewhere below, muffled, angry. One was unmistakably Lady Evelyn's, the other Mrs. Vale's. Miss Marple paused by the door. A few phrases carried up the stairwell between the rumbles of thunder. "You promised me, Evelyn. It was never meant to come out. You'll ruin everything if you speak." Then, a door slammed. Footsteps. Silence. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Ah, dear me," she murmured. "Where there are secrets, there is always a draught under the door." 5. Morning after. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving a washed, clean world. The air was sharp and clear, and the robins sang with tireless cheer. Yet within Alderscombe Manor, the mood was grim. At 8:30, Mrs. Pem the housekeeper burst into the breakfast room, pale and trembling. "My lady! Oh, my lady, it's terrible!" Lady Evelyn, immaculate as ever, looked up from her newspaper. "What is it, Mrs. Pym?" "It's Mrs. Vale, madam. She's lying out in the garden, near the fountain. I think she's dead." There was a terrible stillness. The teacup in Clara's hand slipped and shattered. Mr. Rivington rose sharply, his face draining of color. Miss Marple, calm as always, set down her napkin and said quietly, "Perhaps someone had better telephone the constable." They found Mrs. Lysandra Vale sprawled on the gravel path near the marble fountain, her dressing gown soaked from the night rain, her face serene as though asleep. A broken teacup lay beside her. The smell of almonds hung faintly in the air. Miss Marple knelt beside the body. "Poor dear," she murmured. "She looks quite peaceful." Colonel Melrose, arriving soon after with Inspector Graves, grimly examined the scene. "Poison," he said. "Almost certainly. Cup still half full. I'd wager cyanide." "Suicide?" asked Lady Evelyn faintly, clutching her pearls. Inspector Graves frowned. "Possibly. Though why would a lady go out in the rain in her nightdress to drink poison in the garden? Miss Marple, still kneeling, lifted her gaze to the others. Yes, why indeed? 6. Under the surface by mid-morning the entire village knew. Alderscombe buzzed like a disturbed beehive. At the post office, Mrs. Hatherley was already recounting the tale to anyone who'd listen, each time with fresh embellishments. The vicar offered solemn prayers. The gardener, Tom Larkin, was seen scrubbing the fountain steps with unnecessary vigor, muttering under his breath. At the manor, Inspector Graves questioned the household. He was a methodical man with little patience for the finer points of psychology, which was why he tolerated Miss Marple's presence with thin politeness. "You're welcome to observe, madam," he said stiffly, "but please, no interference." "Of course not," Miss Marple said sweetly, folding her hands. Each member of the household was interviewed. Lady Evelyn insisted Mrs. Vale had been in delicate spirits, and had recently suffered from headaches. She claimed to have retired early, and heard nothing during the storm. Mr. Rivington stated he had remained in his room working on correspondence until morning. His eyes, however, darted nervously each time Lady Evelyn's name was mentioned. Major Fitzroy was genuinely bewildered. Dreadful business. Never saw a hint of melancholy in the woman. Thought she was made of sterner stuff. Clara Denning was pale and tearful. "She was kind to me," she whispered, "but frightened. Lately she said strange things. About secrets and letters. She asked if she could trust me." "Letters?" Inspector Graves asked sharply. Clara shook her head. "She never showed me any." When the questioning ended, Miss Marple joined Colonel Melrose by the fire. "A sad business, Jane," he said quietly. "If it's suicide, it'll all be hushed up, I suppose. Lady Evelyn has influence." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "It might be hushed up," she said, "but that won't make it any less a crime, if crime it was." He looked at her. "You think it wasn't suicide?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that people rarely go out in the pouring rain to end their lives unless someone else sent them there." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "And I think, dear Geoffrey, that Alderscombe has just become rather more interesting." 7. A quiet observation. That afternoon, while the inspector busied himself with official matters, Miss Marple took a quiet walk around the manor grounds. She paused by the fountain, studying the gravel path, the scattered petals from the storm, the broken cup now marked and bagged. She noted the faint indentation of slippers leading from the terrace, not toward it. She noticed also a half-burned candle stub near the fountain edge, and something glinting beneath the shrubbery, a small silver locket, monogrammed E.B. She slipped it delicately into her handkerchief. Later in her room, she examined it. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young man in uniform, quite handsome, with the Bainbridge eyes, Sir Rowland's nephew perhaps, or someone else entirely. Miss Marple's expression softened. "Oh dear," she murmured. "Family secrets again. They do tend to cause such trouble." 8. The funeral announcement. By evening, Lady Evelyn had announced her intention to arrange a discreet funeral. Mrs. Vale had no close family, she declared. "It's best handled quietly." Miss Marple, sitting by the fire, said gently, "That's most considerate of you, Lady Evelyn, though I imagine the coroner may wish to know the cause of death." Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed briefly. "Naturally, but I have no wish for unpleasant speculation." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said. "And yet the truth has a habit of insisting upon itself, rather like a persistent weed." Lady Evelyn's teacup rattled against its saucer. "You speak in riddles, Miss Marple." "Do I? Forgive an old woman's way of thinking aloud. It's only that I have seen so many tragedies begin with the best of intentions, and end in scandal." For the first time, Lady Evelyn's composure cracked. Her color drained, and she looked away. "You mean well, I'm sure. But please leave this matter to the authorities." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Oh, my dear Lady Evelyn, I always do." 9. A village uneasy that night. Alderscombe slept uneasily. Windows were shuttered, curtains drawn. The postmistress claimed to have seen a light burning in the manor's library at midnight. The gardener reported hearing footsteps on the terrace. Even the vicar's cat refused to go out. At Melrose House, Miss Marple sat awake, knitting in silence. Her thoughts moved like threads weaving a pattern: a mysterious guest, a royal connection, a photograph, a quarrel in the night, and the scent of almonds in the rain. Outside, the church bell tolled once, softly, as though in warning. Miss Marple looked up. "The truth," she whispered, "is never far beneath the soil in a village. One only has to know where to dig." And somewhere in the stillness of Alderscombe Manor, Beneath its grand exterior and its whispered secrets, something dark was waiting to be uncovered. Inspector Graves was a conscientious man, but like many men in authority, he preferred facts that behaved themselves. Unfortunately, the facts in the matter of Mrs. Lysandra Vale did not behave at all. The inquest was held in the panelled dining room of Alderscombe Manor, where Lady Evelyn had agreed, reluctantly, to accommodate the proceedings. The coroner, a brisk fellow from Exeter, recorded the statements with methodical precision. Miss Marple attended quietly, sitting near the back, knitting needles clicking softly as witnesses spoke. The post-mortem had confirmed cyanide poisoning. The cup had contained traces of it, and the faint smell of almonds had been unmistakable. Yet there was no bottle of poison found anywhere in Mrs. Vale's room, nor any evidence that she had procured it herself. Her letters and belongings, sparse as they were, revealed little. Only a folded envelope, torn and empty, bearing the faint crest of the royal household. The coroner cleared his throat. Cause of death poisoning. Circumstances uncertain. The verdict shall remain open pending further investigation. Lady Evelyn exhaled sharply through her nose, her fingers tightening around her gloves. Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she rose to leave the room. Guilt, fear, or merely shock? As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple approached Inspector Graves. "A difficult case, Inspector," he grunted. "That it is, madam. The lady was a stranger here, yet clearly of some distinction. I've had a discreet word from London, you understand. We're to tread carefully. No fuss, no headlines," said Miss Marple. "A royal connection, then?" Graves scowled. "I didn't say that." "Of course not." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "But such connections do tend to complicate things, especially when one considers who might wish to silence a woman with knowledge of a scandal." Graves looked at her sharply. "What scandal?" Miss Marple merely resumed her knitting. "Oh, none that I know of. But I imagine Mrs. Vale did." 2. Conversations in the village over the following days. The surface calm of Alderscombe returned, or appeared to. But in every tea shop and drawing room, the tragedy was discussed in careful undertones. Lady Evelyn kept to her rooms. Clara Denning seemed a ghost of herself. Major Fitzroy took to visiting the village inn, to keep up morale. Mr. Rivington was often seen posting letters at odd hours. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her quiet inquiries. Her first call was to the village chemist, Mr. Abner Holt, a stooped, polite man with a love of gossip disguised as concern. "Cyanide, you say?" he repeated when she mentioned the word. "Dear me, I haven't had anyone request that in years. We keep it locked, of course, strict regulations, you know." "Indeed. And no recent purchases?" "None that I recall, Miss Marple. Except, well, Lady Evelyn's gardener did inquire last week about something to treat moles in the rosebeds. I told him cyanide's forbidden for that now. Sold him something milder instead." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "Ah, Mr. Larkin, isn't it?" "Yes, that's the fellow. Quiet sort, but nervous as a cat." "Nervousness," Miss Marple observed gently, "is often a symptom of a conscience, though not always one's own." She thanked him and left, her mind already knitting together new threads. Next, she called upon the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pembroke, under the pretext of tea. Mrs. Pembroke was a dear soul with a tongue that could curdle milk. Such a shocking thing, she sighed, pouring tea into delicate china. "And to think, poor Mrs. Vale seems such a refined creature. Though between you and me, my dear Miss Marple, I did hear she wasn't truly a widow at all." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Oh yes, old Mrs. Hatherley swears her cousin in London saw Mrs. Vale some years ago, under another name entirely, something foreign. She was mixed up with a count or a duke. No one quite knows which. There was talk of letters. Scandalous ones." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Letters can be dangerous things, Mrs. Pembroke. Especially when they involve those with reputations to protect." "Quite so. Why, Lady Evelyn herself was overheard at the FT last year speaking of an indiscretion in the family. I thought nothing of it then, but now." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, it is so easy, isn't it, to dismiss small remarks until the pattern reveals itself." 3. A visit to the gardener. The next morning, Miss Marple found Tom Larkin at work near the fountain, trimming the borders with more diligence than artistry. He was a wary man in his 30s, sunburnt, and perpetually uneasy. "Good morning, Mr. Larkin," Miss Marple greeted cheerfully. "The garden looks lovely, despite the dreadful business." He straightened awkwardly, cap in hand. Thank you, miss. Been trying to keep busy, you know. Hard to forget that night." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "You were here, weren't you? During the storm." Stayed in the gardener's shed, miss. Roof leaks something awful. Heard a scream round midnight, though I thought it was just the wind. Miss Marple's gaze rested gently upon him. And you didn't look? He hesitated. Well, no, miss. Storm like that, you'd think anyone screaming was daft. Didn't want to get struck by lightning for curiosity. She smiled kindly. Quite understandable. Still, I suppose you might have noticed if anyone came down the garden path that night. Tom rubbed his neck. Maybe. Hard to say. Thought I saw a light moving by the terrace, like a candle, but I'd had a bit of so. Miss Marple said, a candle, that's most interesting. And tell me, Mr. Larkin, did you ever find the mole poison Lady Evelyn wanted? His brow furrowed. No, miss. She said leave it be. Said she'd send for something from London. Funny thing though, the bottle she showed me when it came had no label. Said it was a tonic for her roses. Miss Marple's expression did not change. How thoughtful of her. Roses can be demanding. As she walked away, she noted that the gardener's shed window was cracked, and that inside, visible through the grime, stood a small pile of half-burned letters. A photograph and a lie that afternoon. Miss Marple invited Clara Denning to tea at Melrose House. The girl arrived pale, hands twisting nervously in her lap. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, I hope you don't think me inquisitive, but you and Mrs. Vale seemed close. Clara hesitated. I suppose we were. She confided in me sometimes. Said she'd made mistakes. Terrible ones. What sort of mistakes? Clara looked around, as if fearing eavesdroppers. She said she'd once worked as a companion to a lady abroad. Countess. There was a man, an officer, who, well, he wasn't free to marry her. She hinted there was a child. And letters that could ruin someone important. She said Lady Evelyn was helping her keep safe. Helping her? Miss Marple repeated softly. Or silencing her. The Clara flinched. I don't know. Miss Marple leaned forward. You dropped a photograph the other day, Miss Denning. A picture of Mrs. Vale and a man in uniform. Who was he? Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She said it was her husband. But later, she told me he wasn't, that he was the father of her child. She never said his name. Only that he was connected to the crown. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. And the letters? She burned them. Or said she did. But I think she kept one. She was frightened, Miss Marple. Terribly frightened. Miss Marple's knitting rested motionless in her lap. Yes, she said softly, frightened people make mistakes. But so do those who frighten them. 5. The solicitor's secret. That evening, Miss Marple found Mr. Rivington pacing the terrace, smoking furiously. He started when she appeared. Good heavens, Miss Marple, you move like a ghost. I find ghosts are often more visible than the living. She replied mildly. You seem troubled, Mr. Rivington. Who wouldn't be? Dreadful business. I can't think why the woman would poison herself. Miss Marple finished. Yes, it is curious, particularly when one learns she'd recently received a substantial sum of money. Rivington froze. Money? Oh, yes. Paid into her account at Lloyd's, under your authorization, I believe. He flushed. That was a private arrangement. Lady Evelyn instructed me. Of course, said Miss Marple. And yet Mrs. Vale's will, such as it is, makes no mention of Lady Evelyn. Curious, don't you think? Rivington's voice tightened. Miss Marple, I must ask you to refrain from speculation. Speculation is such an unkind word, she said gently. I prefer observation. He flicked away his cigarette and walked off, muttering. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression thoughtful. Money, scandal, and silence, she murmured. It's always the same 3 notes in a tune like this. 6. The letter in the fire. Later that night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple descended quietly to the main library. The house was dark save for the dying embers of the fire. She noticed the faint smell of burned paper. Stooping, she drew from the hearth a fragment of half-charred stationery. Only a few words remained legible. His Majesty's office. Matter must remain confidential. The woman must not speak. Miss Marple folded the fragment carefully into her handkerchief. She was about to leave when she heard a creak behind her. Lady Evelyn stood in the doorway, pale and rigid. Miss Marple, what are you doing here? Merely admiring your lovely library, Miss Marple said serenely, and reflecting on the importance of keeping one's correspondence in order. Lady Evelyn's eyes flickered toward the hearth. You've no right. Oh, my dear lady, Miss Marple interrupted gently, I have no rights at all, only curiosity, and perhaps compassion. Lady Evelyn's voice trembled. You don't understand. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, I understand perfectly. A friend in trouble, perhaps blackmail, perhaps loyalty to someone in high places. It must be very heavy to bear." Lady Evelyn turned away. "Please leave it alone." Miss Marple hesitated, then inclined her head. "Very well. But secrets have a way of escaping, Lady Evelyn, rather like smoke through the chimney." 7. A clue among roses. The next morning, Miss Marple joined Colonel Melrose for breakfast in the conservatory. "You're up early, Jane. Found something, have you?" She smiled. "Only a few small observations. Mrs. Vale's slippers, for instance, found wet, but not muddy, meaning she went out after the rain stopped, not during the storm, and the candle stub by the fountain, burnt only halfway. Someone must have been waiting for her, or meeting her," Miss Marple said. "And consider the silver locket I found, engraved E.B., Lady Evelyn Bainbridge, yet inside the portrait of a man not her husband. Curious, don't you think?" Melrose frowned. "You suspect Lady Evelyn herself?" "I suspect kindness misapplied," Miss Marple said, "and perhaps a debt owed to someone powerful." At that moment, the gardener entered, carrying a basket of roses. "For the morning room, sir." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a smear of white powder on his gloves. "Oh dear, Mr. Larkin, do be careful. That residue. Surely not from your mole treatment." He looked startled. "No, miss! It's from the bottle her ladyship gave me. Said it was to sprinkle near the roots. Funny smell, though, like bitter almonds." Miss Marple's eyes met Colonel Melrose's. She said quietly. "How very unfortunate." 8. The hidden child. That afternoon brought a surprise visitor. A young man in plain clothes, with the bearing of someone used to deference. He introduced himself as Captain Henry Sate, Clare of the royal household. "I'm here regarding the late Mrs. Vale," he said crisply. "Certain papers must be recovered, private papers." Inspector Graves, who had been called at once, eyed him suspiciously. "And under what authority, sir?" "His Majesty's," the captain replied simply. "You'll find discretion is expected." Miss Marple, present by quiet insistence, asked, "Did you know Mrs. Vale, Captain?" He hesitated. "Not personally, but I am aware she once served abroad under another name, Lysandra von Auster. She was involved in an affair that might have embarrassed a member of the royal family." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Hence the letterhead on her correspondence." "Precisely. We believe she was attempting to contact the press. There were rumors she had borne a child by a certain duke, the late Duke of Wexham, to be exact." Lady Evelyn, who had entered mid-conversation, went pale as chalk. Miss Marple noticed. "You knew of this, Lady Evelyn?" She shook her head faintly. "Aye, only after she came here. She begged for my help. She said the child was in danger." "The child?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, a boy, hidden in France during the war. She wanted to bring him home, under his rightful name, Captain Sate." Claire's expression hardened. "That must never happen. The child has no claim, no existence in law." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And Mrs. Vale refused to accept that, I suppose?" He did not answer. Lady Evelyn whispered, "They said they'd protect her if she kept silent." 9. The unraveling thread. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more in her guest room. The threads of the mystery spread before her like a tapestry. The clues, so far a guest with royal connections. A quarrel with her hostess. A bottle of poison in disguise. A locket belonging to Lady Evelyn. A torn letter from His Majesty's office. A frightened companion. A missing child. It was, she thought, a most tragic little puzzle. Her eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the moonlight touched the fountain where Mrs. Vale had fallen. And in that silver light, Miss Marple saw again the path of the footprints. The way they led from the terrace, not toward it. Someone had walked her out there. Someone she trusted enough to meet alone at night. "Kindness misapplied," Miss Marple murmured. "Or loyalty misplaced." She rose, her decision made. "It's time, I think, for one last conversation." 10. A visit after dark. At 10:30, Miss Marple knocked softly on Lady Evelyn's door. The older woman sat before her dressing table, pale and drawn. "You knew she would not stay silent," Miss Marple said quietly. Lady Evelyn's hand trembled. She was desperate. "I tried to reason with her. The letters, the child, it would have destroyed everything. The monarchy, the family. Geoffrey urged me to keep it quiet." "You gave her tea," Miss Marple said, "with something in it." Tears welled in Lady Evelyn's eyes. "Not to kill her, only to calm her. She was hysterical. I didn't realize how strong it was." "She trusted you," Miss Marple said softly. "She thought you her friend." "I was her friend." "She begged for my help, I thought, if she slept, if she forgot." Miss Marple sighed. "Poor dear. One forgets that good intentions are often the deadliest kind. Lady Evelyn buried her face in her hands. What will happen now? That, Miss Marple said gently, depends on whether you tell the truth, or whether you allow others to bury it, as they buried her. Outside, the church bell tolled 11, echoing through the dark garden, where the fountain gleamed faintly in the moonlight. And in that stillness, Miss Marple knew the pattern was nearly complete. One more stitch, and the tapestry would reveal the face of guilt. The following morning dawned grey and mist, laden over the village of Ravensdene. A soft drizzle hung over the rooftops, and the gravel paths glistened faintly under the muted light. The manor house, usually the heart of cheer and society, stood sombre and withdrawn, as though mourning the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Miss Jane Marple rose early, as was her custom, and found herself sipping tea in the small sitting room provided for her at the manor. The scent of lavender from the garden below wafted faintly through the slightly open window, mingling oddly with the heavy scent of damp earth. She sat in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles clicking softly as her mind turned over the events of the previous night. Lady Catherine's death had unsettled the household deeply, but not all grief, Miss Marple noted, was expressed in the same fashion. She had seen far too many tragedies to be deceived by surface appearances. 1. The web of appearances at breakfast. A subdued atmosphere reigned. Sir Reginald, haggard but composed, presided at the head of the table. His voice carried the dull note of habit as he offered perfunctory greetings to his guests. Lady Beatrice, pale but calm, sat opposite him, her pearl necklace resting perfectly against her throat. She was stirring her tea with a slow, deliberate rhythm that betrayed deep thought. The others, Evelyn Drake the secretary, Jonathan Harcourt, the journalist, and Emily Whitby, the cousin, spoke little, and what little they said was cloaked in cautious politeness. Inspector Graves entered midway through the meal, removing his hat with the wary air of a man accustomed to disturbing breakfast tables. "Good morning," he said, with an apologetic nod. "I trust I may join you for a moment, Sir Reginald. A few questions, if you please." "Of course, Inspector," said Sir Reginald heavily. "You are doing your duty." Miss Marple's eyes flicked between them. She continued buttering her toast with apparent serenity, but her mind was keenly alert. "Dr. Pembroke," began Graves, "is convinced Lady Catherine's death was no accident. The quantity of digitalis found in her bloodstream was far too high to be self-administered unintentionally." Evelyn Drake's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. "Digitalis," she murmured. "That's heart medicine, isn't it?" "Indeed," replied the inspector. "But not one Lady Catherine was prescribed." A small murmur ran through the table. Miss Marple noted that Emily Whitby's expression turned quite white, while Jonathan Harcourt's pen, he had brought one even to breakfast, froze mid-note. "I'm told," Graves went on, "that there was a small medicine cabinet in the study. Sir Reginald, may I ask who had access to it?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "The cabinet was generally locked. But the key, well, Catherine sometimes left it in the drawer of her writing desk. Anyone who knew her habits could have found it." "A rather open invitation," murmured the inspector. Lady Beatrice spoke then, her voice calm and even. "Surely, Inspector, you cannot mean to suggest that any of us would." "I mean nothing yet, Lady Beatrice," said Graves mildly. "I'm merely assembling facts." Miss Marple looked up at that. "And facts," she said softly, "hair often like wool. It's not what's visible that matters, but how the threads are connected." The inspector gave her a small, respectful nod. "Quite so, Miss Marple. You've a reputation for such connections." Her blue eyes twinkled faintly. "Only in the smallest of ways, Inspector. I have always found that human nature is much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or Ravensdene Manor." 2. A secret meeting in the garden. By mid-morning, the drizzle had lifted, and Miss Marple, under the pretext of taking a turn about the gardens, set off down the gravel paths with her parasol. The grounds were vast, rolling lawns bordered by yews and beds of roses that had seen better days. Near the edge of the garden stood a small gazebo, where she noticed two figures conversing in low, urgent tones. Evelyn Drake and Jonathan Harcourt. They did not see her at first. Miss Marple, who had long mastered the art of moving unobtrusively, paused by a lilac bush, her parasol shielding her face as she listened. "You promised me, Jonathan," Evelyn hissed. "You said the letter would remain private." "I know," Harcourt replied tensely. "But things have changed. With Lady Catherine dead, if that letter surfaces, I'll be implicated as well. You know how she kept records. She never destroyed anything." Evelyn's face twisted in anguish. Do you think I wanted any of this? She was threatening to ruin me, to send those papers to the newspaper. Your paper. I told you to let me handle it. Harcourt snapped. But you panicked. There was a pause. The wind rustled through the leaves. Do you think she really meant to expose the affair? Evelyn whispered. Affair? Harcourt gave a dry laugh. Don't dramatize, it was politics, nothing more. Her Majesty's government would never forgive certain indiscretions, that's all. And now she's dead, and everyone will think one of us silenced her. Miss Marple quietly withdrew. She had heard enough. Her mind was already weaving together threads: Evelyn's nervousness, Harcourt's ambition, Lady Catherine's connection to a royal scandal, and a letter that had evidently contained dangerous information. But there was something else. Something in the tone of Evelyn's voice that struck her as not guilt, but fear. 3. The confession of Lady Beatrice. That afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Lady Beatrice, who was seated in the library surrounded by her embroidery. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, you must be quite fatigued by all this. Fatigued? Beatrice smiled faintly. That's a mild word for it, Miss Marple. I am haunted. Catherine and I were not close, but she was part of our lives here. And now, poison. She laid her embroidery down, her hands trembling. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. I imagine Lady Catherine's presence changed the household quite considerably. She was not a woman easily ignored. Beatrice gave a bitter little laugh. No indeed. She was charming, fatally so. Men adored her, women distrusted her. She had a gift for uncovering secrets, and she used it without scruple. There was silence for a moment. Then Beatrice leaned forward. Do you know, Miss Marple, that she once told me she possessed something that could destroy this family? Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. Destroy the family, Lady Beatrice. She said she had a letter, proof of an indiscretion committed long ago by one of the Crown's cousins. Reginald's uncle, I believe. A foolish affair with a stage actress. She implied that Reginald's position, and his pension, were at risk should the truth ever come to light. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see, that would indeed qualify as a scandal, particularly if it involved royal blood. She never said as much directly. Beatrice went on. But she loved her power. She was always hinting, always manipulating. Reginald suffered under her whims, but murder, her voice broke slightly. No, I cannot believe it of anyone here. Miss Marple looked down thoughtfully. Oh, I can believe it, my dear. People will kill for money or love, but most often, they kill for fear. 4. The disappearance of the letter that evening. As the storm returned with renewed fury, a commotion broke out in the study. Miss Marple, who had been reading quietly by the fire, rose and followed the sound. Inspector Graves was there, along with Sir Reginald and a visibly shaken Evelyn Drake. The writing desk had been forced open, its drawers rifled. The letter's gone, Evelyn cried. The one Lady Catherine kept in the sealed envelope. It's been stolen. Graves scowled. Who knew it was here? Only Catherine and I, Evelyn said. And perhaps Sir Reginald. She once showed it to him during one of her tempers. Sir Reginald's face hardened. That's a lie. I never knew where she kept it. Miss Marple's calm voice interjected. If I may, Inspector, it would be most interesting to know what precisely was in that letter. Graves turned. You seem to know something, Miss Marple. Only what one gathers from observation, she said mildly. Lady Catherine had a habit of power, not of discretion. I suspect that letter contained some mention of her own dealings, perhaps a hint of blackmail. Evelyn's silence was telling. Blackmail, said Graves grimly, fits rather neatly with poison. Just then, Jonathan Harcourt entered, rain dripping from his coat. What's all this? He demanded. The letter's missing, said Graves curtly. Harcourt's eyes flicked sharply to Evelyn, then back to the inspector. Then you'd best find it quickly. That letter's worth a small fortune. To the right journalist. Miss Marple caught the fleeting smirk that followed those words, and her suspicion deepened. 5. A night of unease. The household retired early, but sleep eluded most. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard footsteps, a faint, hurried tread along the corridor outside her room. She rose, slipped on her shawl, and opened her door a fraction. A figure was moving swiftly toward the east wing, toward the gallery where Lady Catherine's portrait hung, quiet as a shadow. Miss Marple followed. In the dim light, she saw Emily Whitby, her dressing gown clutched tightly around her, staring up at the painting. Why did you have to come here? Emily whispered. Why couldn't you leave things as they were? She turned suddenly and gasped to see Miss Marple. "Oh, you frightened me, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "You seem troubled." No, it's nothing," Emily stammered. "I couldn't sleep, that's all. This house feels cursed." Miss Marple looked up at the portrait. "Lady Catherine seems to look down upon us still, doesn't she? A most striking resemblance to you, if I may say so." Emily's eyes widened. "To me. Indeed, the same eyes, though perhaps hers held more calculation. Were you close, my dear?" Emily hesitated. "She was my cousin, but I hardly knew her until she came here. I wish I never had." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "family can be complicated, and secrets, well, they have a way of finding their way home." 6. The second shock the next morning brought a fresh alarm. A scream echoed through the corridors, Evelyn Drake's voice. The household rushed to the breakfast room, where she stood trembling by the French doors. On the terrace outside lay Jonathan Harcourt, lifeless. Inspector Graves arrived moments later, his face grim, no signs of struggle. A single blow to the back of the head with something heavy, perhaps that bronze statue. Miss Marple examined the scene with quiet efficiency. "And yet," she murmured, "no blood spatter. He must have been struck elsewhere and brought here." Graves frowned. "Why move the body?" "To create confusion," said Miss Marple. "To suggest that our culprit is cleverer than they are. But perhaps," she added, her blue eyes narrowing, "it was meant to silence someone before they could talk." She looked at Evelyn Drake, who had gone pale as parchment. "Miss Drake, you and Mr. Harcourt had a disagreement yesterday, did you not?" Evelyn's lips trembled. "Where we argued, yes. But he was alive when I left him." "Of course," said Miss Marple gently. "You seem an honest girl. But honesty alone rarely saves one from suspicion." 7. Miss Marple's quiet discovery that afternoon, while the household was in turmoil. Miss Marple paid a discreet visit to the study once more. The drawers had been searched thoroughly, but she had a different approach. She noticed a slight misalignment in the panel beneath the desk, a small gap where the wood had warped. Carefully, she pressed it open and withdrew a thin packet of papers, tied with faded ribbon. Inside were several letters, some in Lady Catherine's hand, others typed. One bore the royal seal. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, so that's what you meant, my lady. But you kept too many secrets for too long." Among the papers was a torn scrap of note, evidently written in haste. "If anything happens to me, the truth lies not in the letter, but in the locket." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The locket," she murmured. "And who wears one, I wonder?" She recalled Emily Whitby's portrait, like resemblance to Lady Catherine, and the small gold locket she had worn since her arrival. The pieces were aligning, but Miss Marple, wise as ever, knew better than to rush to judgment, for in every puzzle, there is always one piece deliberately misplaced. 8. A village gossip before supper. Miss Marple took a quiet walk into the village, where she encountered Mrs. Hargreaves, the postmistress and resident gossip. "Terrible goings on up at the manor, Miss Marple," she exclaimed. "First the lady, now the journalist! Mark my words, it's that secretary, always scribbling things down, looking over her shoulder. Never trust a woman with spectacles, I say." Miss Marple chuckled. "I shall bear that in mind, Mrs. Hargreaves. Tell me, did Lady Catherine ever post anything of interest?" "Letters, yes. Fancy envelopes too, thick paper, crest on the flap. One went off last week to some London address. Buckingham something or other. Buckingham Palace. That's the one. And she sent it registered post, mind you, said it was confidential." Miss Marple smiled thoughtfully. "Confidential indeed." 9. The puzzle nears completion that evening. The manor gathered in the drawing room once again. The tension was palpable. Inspector Graves had little progress to report. No signs of forced entry, no strangers seen near the property. The weapon hasn't been found. Miss Marple sat knitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the fire. Then she said softly, "I believe, Inspector, that the time has come to call our murderer's bluff." All eyes turned to her. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple," said Graves. "I have a small theory," she said, "and if I'm right, it will not be long before our culprit reveals themselves. For guilt, my dear Inspector, is a restless bedfellow." She looked toward the window, where Emily Whitby stood apart, her hands clasped around her locket. 10. The stage is set that night. Miss Marple requested a private word with Sir Reginald. "I have reason to believe," she said, "that Lady Catherine's death was connected not only to the letter, but to something much older. A secret that was never hers to tell." Sir Reginald looked stricken. "You mean the royal affair?" I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that Lady Catherine discovered that Emily Whitby was not her cousin at all, but her daughter." Sir Reginald stared at her. Her daughter, born out of that very scandal Lady Catherine threatened to expose. She used the secret to control those around her, but in the end, it was her own blood who had most to lose. Sir Reginald buried his face in his hands. "Good Lord, does Emily know?" "I believe she does now," said Miss Marple softly, "and she may be ready to confess, or to kill again." The wind howled through Ravensdene Manor that night, and Miss Marple, with her knitting folded neatly on her lap, waited for the final thread to unravel. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring the revelation, and in the quiet corners of her mind, she could already see how the pieces fit together, how greed, fear, and love had conspired beneath the elegant veneer of English gentility. For as Miss Marple often said to herself, murder may be an ugly thing, but it is always invariably human. One morning calm before the storm, the following morning broke bright and cold. After 2 days of mist and drizzle, the sun's return seemed almost indecent, its cheerful rays mocking the gloom that hung over Ravensdene Manor. Birds chirped in the yews, and dew glistened upon the lawns as though nothing dreadful had ever occurred there. But within the house, shadows persisted. Sir Reginald had shut himself in his study, refusing breakfast. Lady Beatrice kept to her room, pleading fatigue. Evelyn Drake moved through the corridors like a ghost, pale, distracted, and perpetually twisting her handkerchief. Only Miss Marple seemed composed, seated serenely in the morning room, knitting what appeared to be a small tea cosy. Her eyes, however, were anything but idle. They flicked occasionally toward the window, where the gravel path wound toward the churchyard. Inspector Graves joined her not long after, looking wary but resolute. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I've scarcely slept. Every thread I pull seems to lead nowhere." She gave him a small smile. "That's because you've been tugging at the threads, Inspector, when you ought to be looking at the pattern." He sighed. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," she said, "though not easy. People are the same everywhere, you know. One only has to understand what they fear most." Graves leaned against the mantelpiece. "You think fear lies at the heart of this?" "Oh yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Lady Catherine inspired fear in almost everyone she met. That is both the reason she died, and the reason her killer now trembles. 2. The locket's secret at 11 o'clock. Miss Marple requested that all remaining guests gather in the drawing room. She had that gentle, unassuming authority that made refusal impossible. Lady Beatrice came in first, elegant as always though her hands shook slightly. Sir Reginald followed, his face drawn and grey. Evelyn Drake entered quietly, avoiding all eyes. Last came Emily Whitby, pale but composed, her golden locket glinting faintly against her black morning dress. Inspector Graves stood near the door, notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, "you asked us all here. I trust you have something to tell us." She smiled benignly. "Not to tell, Inspector, merely to show. The truth, I think, prefers to reveal itself." They watched as she reached into her handbag and drew out a small envelope, yellowed with age. "This," she said, "was hidden behind a panel in Lady Catherine's desk. It contains several letters, some private, some official. But more importantly, I found a note in Lady Catherine's own handwriting. If anything happens to me, the truth lies not in the letter, but in the locket." Her eyes turned to Emily. "My dear Miss Whitby," she said gently, "you've worn that locket every day since you arrived. Would you permit me to see it?" Emily's face went white. "My locket? Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple kindly, "I believe it contains something more valuable than a portrait." You for a moment. No one moved. Then, slowly, trembling, Emily unclasped the chain and handed the locket to Miss Marple. With delicate fingers, the old lady opened it. Inside, beneath the tiny miniature of a lady's face, was a folded slip of paper, so small it could have been overlooked forever. Miss Marple unfolded it and read aloud, "To my daughter Emily, forgive me for the silence. When the time comes, this will explain everything. See." The room fell utterly still. Lady Beatrice gasped. Sir Reginald dropped into a chair. "Her daughter," he whispered hoarsely. "Good heavens!" Emily covered her face with her hands. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "Not until the night she died. She told me everything, how she had hidden my birth to protect her reputation. I thought she meant to acknowledge me, to set things right. But then she laughed and said she'd never tell, that I was to remain her secret forever." Miss Marple's voice was soft but clear, so she controlled even her own child, as she controlled everyone else. Emily looked up, eyes wild. You don't understand. She threatened to ruin me, to tell everyone I was illegitimate, that my father was some nameless nobleman. She said I'd never be accepted, that no one would marry me. I begged her to stop. Sir Reginald rose unsteadily. You killed her? No, Emily cried. I only meant to frighten her. I went to her room with her medicine. I wanted to switch the bottles, to make her ill, not to kill her, but she drank the wrong one before I could stop her. Miss Marple regarded her gravely. That is not quite true, my dear. She did not drink by mistake. You replaced the label on the bottle, and when she took her evening dose, you stood by and watched. You meant her no harm at first, but when she mocked you, you lost control. It happens more often than one imagines. Emily's sobs filled the room. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Miss Whitby, I must ask, did you also strike Mr. Harcourt? Emily shook her head vehemently. No! I swear it wasn't me! He came to me that night, said he knew about the locket, that he'd expose me unless I gave him money. I ran away from him. I didn't kill him. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. No, my dear. That much I believe. You are not strong enough to have dragged his body onto the terrace. That deed belonged to another hand. 3. The second murder. All eyes turned to Sir Reginald. He had gone very still, his face ashen. Then he gave a low, bitter laugh. You're clever, Miss Marple. Too clever by half. Graves straightened. Sir Reginald, what do you mean by that? Reginald looked around the room, eyes hollow. I found Harcourt in the library that night, rifling through Catherine's papers. He told me he had proof she was blackmailing half the county, including myself. He wanted money to keep it quiet. Miss Marple nodded gently. And you obliged him? With a blow from the bronze statue, perhaps? Yes, said Reginald quietly. He was shouting, threatening to publish everything. I struck him once. It was an accident. But when I saw him fall, when I realized what I'd done, something inside me broke. Beatrice cried out. Reginald. He turned to her with sudden fierceness. You think I didn't know what Catherine had done to me? To us? She destroyed my honor, my peace. She was going to ruin the family name. And for what? To flaunt some scandal that should have stayed buried forever. Miss Marple's tone was almost maternal. And so you buried her scandal with another. You moved the body, created confusion, hoping the investigation would stop at Emily. He gave a wan smile. You've quite the mind for murder, Miss Marple. Not murder, Sir Reginald, she said quietly, merely for human folly. You see, I recognize something in you, the exhaustion of a man who has been cornered for too long. He sank back into his chair, defeated. Inspector Graves took a deep breath. Sir Reginald Ravensdene, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. He nodded. Yes, Inspector. I shall come. Beatrice caught his hand as he passed her. Reginald, why didn't you tell me? He looked at her with infinite weariness. Because, my dear, I wished to spare you the shame. And now I have given you worse. 4. The quiet aftermath. When they were gone, silence fell upon the room once more. Lady Beatrice sat staring into the fire, her embroidery lying forgotten beside her. Evelyn Drake sobbed softly, while Emily remained slumped in her chair, pale and trembling. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the bright, deceptively peaceful morning. Inspector Graves returned after a while. His expression softened. It's a tragic case, he said. 2 deaths, one by poison, one by rage. I suppose you were right, Miss Marple. Fear was at the root of it all. She smiled faintly. Fear and pride. One might almost call them twin poisons, Inspector. He nodded slowly. You've done a great service. Oh no, she said, folding her knitting. I merely listened. Most people talk too much, you know. The truth often comes in whispers. 5. Tea and reflection. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat with Lady Beatrice in the sunlit garden. The scent of roses drifted gently through the air. The manner, though quiet, seemed lighter somehow. Its oppressive tension lifted. Beatrice poured tea with trembling hands. Do you believe, Miss Marple, that anyone can recover from such a scandal? My dear, said Miss Marple kindly, time heals everything except bad manners and unpaid bills. The world forgets faster than we think. Besides, people will always find comfort in tragedy. It gives them something to talk about over tea. Beatrice gave a weak laugh. You have a curious way of looking at things. Miss Marple smiled. I've merely learned that truth, like good china, is often cracked, but still serviceable. She looked across the lawn where Emily Whitby stood, speaking softly to Evelyn Drake. That young woman will have a difficult road, she murmured, but she will walk it. There is courage in her yet. 6. The inspector's farewell that evening. Inspector Graves found Miss Marple seated once again by the fire. "I must say," he remarked, "you have an uncanny gift. When I first saw you, I thought you a harmless old lady with a fondness for knitting." "And so I am," said Miss Marple cheerfully. "But one can do a good deal of thinking while knitting, you know. The needles occupy the hands and that frees the mind." Graves smiled. "If every constable had your insight, the yard would be out of work." She chuckled softly. "Heaven forbid, but I dare say we each serve our purpose, Inspector. Yours is to uphold the law. Mine perhaps is only to notice when it is broken." 7. The final thread. The next morning, Miss Marple prepared to leave Ravensdene. Her suitcase was neatly packed, her shawl folded on top. Lady Beatrice insisted on seeing her off personally. "I cannot thank you enough," she said, as they stood by the waiting car. "You've saved this house from complete ruin." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear. I merely held up a mirror. What you choose to see in it, that is your salvation." She smiled her gentle, knowing smile and stepped into the car. As it rolled down the drive, she looked back once at the grand facade of Ravensdene Manor. The sun glinted off its windows like eyes that had at last ceased their weeping. "Poor Catherine," she murmured to herself. "You built your life on secrets, and in the end, it was a secret that destroyed you. Yet how human that is." She took up her knitting once more as the car trundled toward the village, the rhythmic click of the needles mingling with the hum of the motor. "Human nature," she said softly, "is a curious pattern. One never tires of unraveling it." 8. Epilogue. Sate. Mary Mead. Reflections. A week later, Miss Marple was back in her cozy cottage in St. Mary Mead. The kettle was whistling merrily, and her canary was singing in the window. Her friend, Mrs. Bantry, called in for tea and, inevitably, gossip. "So you've been in the thick of it again, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, eyes wide with fascination. "A royal scandal, they say. How thrilling." Miss Marple smiled demurely. "Oh, my dear, there was nothing thrilling about it, only sad. Pride, deceit and fear, all tangled up like old lace." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "You must tell me every detail." "I shall," said Miss Marple, pouring tea. "Though I must warn you, the truth is never quite as exciting as people imagine. It's usually far more ordinary. And yet," she added with a twinkle, "I suppose that's why it's so dangerous." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Jane, I do believe you enjoy these little adventures." Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps, but only because they remind me how very much alike we all are. Kings, housemaids, and murderers alike." The clock chimed 4. Outside, the church bells rang faintly in the distance. Miss Marple looked out at the peaceful lane of St. Mary Mead, where nothing more sinister than a missing cat was ever likely to occur. Until the next time, of course. And as the teapot steamed between them, she said in her gentle, thoughtful voice, "One must never underestimate the quiet places of the world, my dear. They hold more secrets than any palace." The morning after Miss Marple's long conversation with Inspector Crail dawned grey and still. A heavy mist hung over the village of Marling Edge, softening the outlines of the cottages and cloaking the spires of St. Andrew's Church. The village seemed hushed, as if holding its breath for what was to come. In the drawing room of Marling Hall, the fire had been lit early. The servants moved with quiet urgency, setting out tea and biscuits, while Lady Tressida sat alone, pale and distant, her eyes fixed on the window. Miss Marple arrived punctually at 10, wearing her neat dove, grey coat and carrying her knitting bag. There was something purposeful in her step today, though her manner remained as gentle and unassuming as ever. "Good morning, Lady Tressida," she said mildly. "I do hope you don't mind my intrusion again. I'm afraid I've had something on my mind all night, and I thought it best we talk before Inspector Crail gathers everyone for the inquest." Lady Tressida nodded faintly. "Of course, Miss Marple. Please, sit. I've scarcely slept myself." "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple, settling herself with a small sigh. "It's always the way with these dreadful matters. One keeps turning things over and over in one's mind, until the truth insists upon being seen. It was rather the same when old Mrs. Fennell's nephew claimed he'd found her recipe book missing, only it turned out to be his own doing after all." The faintest twitch of a smile crossed Lady Tressida's lips, but her eyes remained shadowed. "And do you believe you've seen the truth of this business, Miss Marple?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied softly, "that the truth has been sitting quietly among us all along, like a spider in its web, waiting for us to stumble upon it." At that moment, the drawing-room door opened, and Inspector Crail entered, followed by Dr. Pritchard, Reverend Cotterell, and Mr. Edmund Hale. Behind them came Miss Sylvia Denham, her face drawn, and Mr. Gerald Ashcombe, immaculate as ever, though there was a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. Crail cleared his throat. Miss Marple has asked for us all to be here. She's made certain observations, she says, and since she's been right before, I thought it best we hear her out before the coroner's proceedings. Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. You're very kind, Inspector. I hope I shan't take up too much time. You see, the matter of Lord Tressidor's death has puzzled me terribly, not because of its violence, but because of its subtlety. Poison, after all, is a coward's weapon, and yet this particular poison was administered with such precision that it suggests neither panic nor accident. She paused, looking around the room. All eyes were on her. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to have stopped ticking. It began, she continued, with the assumption that Lord Tressidor was poisoned by strychnine placed in his after-dinner port. But there were two problems with that. First, no one recalled seeing anyone pour the port, but Lord Tressidor himself, and second, the bottle contained only trace remnants of the substance, suggesting that the poison had been introduced before the evening began. Gerald Ashcombe shifted in his chair. Surely that points to the servants. Yes, said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. One would think so. But the servants had no motive, and more importantly, the butler, Dobson, confirmed that the decanter had been locked in the cellarette since the previous morning. Only two people had keys to that cabinet: Lord Tressidor himself, and his son, Mr. Edmund Hale. Edmund went pale. Are you suggesting? Patience, my dear, said Miss Marple kindly. No, I do not believe you poisoned your father. In fact, I believe you had no idea at all of what was being planned. Crail frowned. Then who did? Miss Marple. She turned her head slowly toward Lady Tressidor. You see, the question that troubled me most was this. Why was the note from the palace so important that it had to be destroyed? Why would a man as proud as Lord Tressidor risk his life over a mere letter? It seemed absurd, unless the letter was not what it appeared to be. Lady Tressidor's hands trembled on her lap. What do you mean? Miss Marple looked at her with deep compassion. I mean, my dear, that the so-called royal letter was never genuine at all. It was forged. Forged quite cleverly, on old stationery that Mr. Ashcombe happened to possess from his previous legal work for a royal estate. Gasps went round the room. Gerald Ashcombe stood abruptly, his face flushing. That is a monstrous suggestion. Miss Marple went on calmly. I thought so too, until I examined the blotting pad in the library last night. You must forgive my curiosity, Mr. Ashcombe, but I noticed the faint impression of a signature that did not match the official hand used in the palace correspondence of the time. You see, I once helped a vicar's wife in Chipping Cleghorn identify forged parish donations, and the principle is the same. Crail gave a short, incredulous laugh. So you're saying Ashcombe forged the letter to blackmail Lord Tressidor? Miss Marple shook her head. Not quite. Mr. Ashcombe was indeed involved, but he was not the mastermind. The motive was more personal, and far more tragic. Her eyes softened as she turned toward Lady Tressidor once more. You knew, didn't you, that your husband intended to disinherit your nephew, and that he planned to reveal a scandal from many years past? A scandal that would have destroyed your family name. Lady Tressidor closed her eyes. I never meant for him to die, she whispered. Sylvia gave a strangled cry. Aunt Helena? The silence that followed was suffocating. Only the faint hiss of the fire broke it. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. It was Lady Tressidor. She discovered the forgery after the fact, and when she confronted Mr. Ashcombe, he admitted what he'd done. But she saw an opportunity. She used that forged letter to convince her husband that the Crown would take interest in his scandal, unless he complied with her wishes. When he refused, she placed a small dose of strychnine into his tonic bottle, assuming he'd drink it gradually and fall ill later, never imagining he'd take a full measure that very night. Tears welled in Lady Tressidor's eyes. Was cruel, Miss Marple. He had ruined everything. My name, my family, my peace. He said he would send Sylvia away, that she'd be tainted by the shame. I only wanted to frighten him. Miss Marple nodded sadly. I do believe that, but poisons have no conscience, Lady Tressidor. They do not distinguish between revenge and regret. Crail exhaled slowly. You've done it again, Miss Marple. You've tied the threads where we couldn't even see the knots. Mr. Ashcombe's composure crumbled. I only meant to frighten him as well, he muttered. The letter was my doing. I forged it to make him yield over the estate finances, but I never thought she'd take it further. Miss Marple's expression was grave but kind. "The truth often catches us all in its web, Mr. Ashcombe. One deceit leads to another, and before we know it, tragedy has taken its toll." Lady Tressider sat motionless, her face a mask of quiet despair. "What will become of me, Inspector?" Crail looked uncomfortable. "That's not for me to say, my lady. But the coroner will need a full statement." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Perhaps, Inspector, you might allow her a moment of privacy first. I think she will tell the truth. She's not one for concealment any longer." Crail nodded, and he and the others withdrew. Only Miss Marple remained, standing by the fire as Lady Tressider wept quietly. After a time Lady Tressider looked up. "Do you despise me, Miss Marple?" "Despise you? No indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "I've seen much of human frailty in my life, my dear. There's a saying in St. Mary Mead, 'Evil often wears the face of despair.' You were desperate, frightened, and terribly lonely. It doesn't excuse the act, but it does explain the heart behind it." Lady Tressider bowed her head. "I suppose that is some small comfort." When Miss Marple left Marling Hall that afternoon, the mist had lifted, revealing a pale sun struggling through the clouds. The village was stirring again, children ran along the lane, and Mrs. Pettigrew was scolding her cat from the cottage door. Life, it seemed, was resuming its ordinary rhythm. At the gate Reverend Cotterell met her. "A terrible business, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "And yet you handled it with such grace. I don't know how you manage it." "Oh," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly, "one learns to see patterns, Reverend. People are rather like knitting, you know. Drop one stitch, and the whole design begins to unravel. But mend it carefully, and order can be restored." He chuckled softly. "You make it sound almost hopeful." "I should think it is," said Miss Marple. "After all, even after the darkest scandal, life insists on beginning again. A cup of tea, a little kindness, and one can almost believe the world is set right." That evening, back at her cottage in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily. The day's events lingered in her thoughts like the last strains of a melancholy tune. She thought of Lady Tressider, of Edmund and Sylvia, and of how pride and fear had twisted love into something tragic. But she also thought of the flowers blooming outside her window, and of the postman's cheery whistle as he passed by each morning. The small, ordinary things that reminded her the world still turned, no matter how dark the shadows it cast. She smiled to herself, poured a fresh cup of tea, and murmured quietly, "Human nature, my dear, is the same everywhere, whether in palaces or parlors." The clock chimed softly in the hall. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the firelight flickering over her serene face. Outside, the first stars appeared over St. Mary Mead, as peaceful and eternal as truth itself.